There are things people believe in absolutely. Not because they have checked, but because everyone around them said so. Experts, governments, common sense. And in 1939, one of those sacred truths was the British pound sterling. It was not just money. It was the symbol of an empire on which, as they said, the sun never sets. A currency trusted by banks on 5 continents, and a banknote considered absolutely impossible to counterfeit. The Bank of England was convinced large banknotes were so well protected that any attempt at counterfeiting was doomed to fail. This was not the overconfidence of a single official. This was the official position of the central bank of the British Empire. The first barrier was the paper. The banknotes were printed on a special material made from linen rags. It was produced by the only factory in the world, Portal in Hertfordshire. To the touch, held up to the light under ultraviolet, it was unique. Reproducing it seemed impossible. The second barrier was the watermarks. The figure of Britannia held up to the light was not simply a drawing. It was a work of engraving art with microscopic shadows and halftones. Copying such a thing by hand meant years of jeweler precision work. The third barrier was the serial numbers. The Bank of England used a system that no one on the outside knew about. Every number on a banknote was mathematically linked to the date of issue, the denomination, and the position on the printed sheet. Any deviation, and a bank clerk would see it immediately. In London, this protection was believed in without question. 3 barriers, 3 layers, 3 reasons to consider the pound untouchable. The Bank of England did not entertain even the thought that anyone could break through all 3, but in Berlin they thought differently. In 1939, the head of the Reich criminal police, Arthur Neighbour, placed one idea on the table: to attack Britain not with bombs, but with its own money, to print billions of pounds and drop them from aircraft directly over English cities. People would pick up the money, start spending it. Prices would soar and the economy would collapse from within. A weapon without a single shot fired. But for the plan to work, one problem had to be solved first, a problem the Bank of England itself considered unsolvable. To print a perfect pound, one so convincing that even the specialists of the Bank of England could not tell the difference from a real one. That was the task the Reich set for itself in 1939. And it was prepared to use any means necessary to achieve it. The operation did not begin with printing presses. It began with a man who knew how to do dirty work cleanly. Alfred Naujoks was exactly that kind of man. An SS officer, an intelligence operative, an executor. It was he who in 1939 received the order to launch the first version of the operation under the code name Andreas. Naujoks assembled a small group of engravers and printers. They worked in a secret workshop, trying different paper, different inks, different methods. Month after month, the result was always the same. The banknotes looked like counterfeits. Operation Andreas was shut down. The Reich needed a different approach. In 1942, the operation was relaunched. A new name, a new commander. SS Sturmbannführer Bernhard Kruger was a man of a different kind. Not a strong man, not an intelligence officer. A pedant, a technocrat, a man with an engineering mind. It was he who turned an adventure into an industrial project. Kruger understood from the very beginning. To counterfeit the pound perfectly, you did not just need printers. You needed artists, engravers, mathematicians, bank clerks, people who understood money from the inside, people with skilled hands and sharp minds. And he knew where to find them. The Reich concentration camps held tens of thousands of educated Jews, doctors, engineers, lawyers, artists. People whom the system was destroying like garbage possessed exactly the skills Kruger needed. He began traveling from camp to camp, one by one. Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Buchenwald. Kruger conducted the selection personally. He looked at their hands, asked about their profession, checked their education. Those who qualified received one and the same offer they could not refuse: to go with him, to work, to live. Among those selected was a young Slovak Jew by the name of Adolf Berger, an engraver by profession, a man with absolute precision in his hands. In 1942, he was standing in the selection queue at Auschwitz. Left or right, live or die. The officer looked at his hands and asked one word, "Profession." Berger answered, "Engraver." The officer made a sign. He was pulled out of the queue. He did not yet understand what had happened. He did not know where they were taking him. He knew only one thing. Today, he would not die. And in Auschwitz, that was already a great deal. Around 140 people like Berger were recruited. Engravers, printers, artists, mathematicians, former bank employees, all Jews, all professionals. All of them were brought to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp outside Berlin, to two barracks numbered 18 and 19. The barracks were separated from the rest of the camp by an additional barbed wire fence. The windows were painted over with white paint. Even the SS guards outside did not know what was happening inside. For the rest of the camp, these two barracks simply did not exist. Inside, the prisoners found something that existed nowhere else in the Nazi camp system. Normal beds with sheets, civilian clothes instead of prison uniforms, permission to keep their hair, food better than what the SS guards outside received, cigarettes, a radio, board games in the evenings. It was called the Golden Cage, and everyone inside understood its true price. They were carriers of a secret. In German, this was called Geheimnisträger, people who knew too much, and carriers of secrets in the Reich were never released. They were eliminated when they were no longer needed. They lived as long as they printed. That was the only rule that mattered. Not orders, not the daily schedule, not relations with the guards. Just one thing: as long as the work continues, they live. The moment the work ends, so do they. Adolf Berger understood this within his first days there. He sat at a table with an engraving tool in his hands and looked at a British £5 banknote. Beautiful paper, a complex design, the figure of Britannia in the center. His task was to reproduce it with accuracy to fractions of a millimetre. His life depended on how well he managed it. Kruger set the team a clear goal. The pound had to pass inspection in any bank in the world. Not just similar, not just acceptable. Perfect. And the work began. The first thing the team encountered was the paper. It might seem like the simplest problem. Paper is paper. But this was precisely where the operation almost ended before it began. Because the British pound was printed on a material that existed nowhere else in the world. German chemists took a genuine British banknote and began analyzing it. The fiber composition, the density, the reaction under ultraviolet light. The conclusion was clear. The paper was made from linen, but not from raw linen. From processed linen rags, old sails, sacks, clothing that had been through dozens of washes. It was precisely the repeated use and washing that gave the fibers the necessary softness and structure. New linen was too stiff, too clean, too perfect. Under ultraviolet, it glowed differently. To the touch, it felt differently. Any experienced cashier would have sensed the difference immediately. The team began experiments. Pure linen, mixtures with cotton, different proportions, different processing methods. Month after month, the result was always the same. The paper came out too perfect. Kruger would look at each new sample, hold it up to the light, and silently set it aside. Not good enough. The answer came by chance, as it often does in science. One of the chemists noticed the microstructure of the British paper under strong magnification. The fibers were not simply soft. They were contaminated at a molecular level. Decades of use had left traces in the linen structure that were impossible to recreate in a laboratory. The solution was found. The Nazis began purchasing thousands of tons of old textiles through neutral Turkey. Dirty linen sacks, old sails, worn clothing. All of it was washed, processed, and turned into paper pulp. The result was striking. The paper finally rustled the way it was supposed to, but that was not enough. Even with the correct linen, the paper still glowed under ultraviolet slightly differently from the British original. The SS chemists began analyzing the water, and they discovered something unexpected. The water at the British Portal factory in Hertfordshire was dirtier than German water. Not dirtier in the everyday sense. A different chemical composition, different minerals, a different level of impurities. They began artificially contaminating the water, adding the necessary chemical components. They adjusted the composition by trial and error, again and again, until one day a sample was placed on Kruger's desk and he held it up to the light. He looked for a long time. Then he nodded. The first barrier had been overcome. While the chemists were solving the paper problem, the engravers were struggling with the watermarks. Adolf Berger worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day. In front of him, under a powerful magnifying glass, lay a genuine British banknote. His task was to reproduce the figure of Britannia, the woman with the trident, with accuracy to fractions of a millimetre. Watermarks were not created with ink. They were created by the very structure of the paper. For this, a metal mesh was needed, a matrix in which every wire created the necessary shadow and the necessary halftone. Making such a matrix by hand meant weeks of painstaking work over every single millimetre. Kruger inspected every matrix personally. He would take a test impression, turn off the light and hold it up to a lamp. He would look through it for a long time without saying a word. The slightest deviation in the expression of Britannia's face, a slightly darker shadow under the eye, a slightly less defined line of the shoulder, and the entire batch went to waste. The engraver would start again. Berger later recalled this period as a strange combination of terror and professional excitement. He was an artist. The task before him was impossible in its complexity, and somewhere deep inside, behind the fear and the exhaustion, lived something resembling a professional challenge. He wanted to do it perfectly, not for the Reich, for himself. Weeks turned into months. The matrices were remade again and again. Until one day, Kruger held up another sample to the light, froze, turned to Berger and said one word. Good. From Kruger's lips, that word sounded like the highest possible reward. The second barrier had been overcome. The third remained. The most mysterious one. The serial numbers. The serial numbers were the final barrier, and the most mysterious one. The Bank of England did not print numbers in sequence the way other central banks did. The system worked differently. Every number on every banknote was the result of a complex mathematical calculation. The number was linked to several parameters simultaneously. The date of issue of the banknote, its denomination, its position on the printed sheet, because a banknote in the upper left corner of the sheet had a different code from one in the lower right, and the signature of the Bank of England cashier, which changed every few years. To print a banknote with the correct paper and perfect watermarks, but with a number that did not correspond to the date of issue, meant failure. Any bank clerk with reference tables would spot the discrepancy within a few seconds. The system had been designed precisely for that purpose. Kruger set the team a task that seemed impossible: to crack the Bank of England algorithm without having access to the algorithm itself, based solely on the analysis of real banknotes. For this work, a mathematician named Albert Langer was assigned from within the team. Langer was given access to thousands of genuine British banknotes collected by SS intelligence from across occupied Europe. Banknotes of different denominations, different years, different cashiers. He would lay them out on the table, record the numbers, dates, and denominations. He looked for patterns. Day after day, week after week, the work resembled solving a cipher without a key. Langer filled enormous tables with figures, ran calculations, formed hypotheses, and tested them against new banknotes. Most hypotheses collapsed at the first check. He would start again. An SS officer with a cigarette stood behind him every single day. One night, Langer rose from his table, walked to the blackboard covered in formulas, and drew a single line in chalk connecting two columns of figures. He looked at what he had produced for a long time. Then he quietly said one sentence. "I have found the key." The Bank of England algorithm had been cracked. The team could now generate serial numbers that existed within the Bank of England system. A banknote carrying such a number would appear to any cashier as completely genuine. All three barriers had been overcome. The paper, the watermarks, the serial numbers. Production could begin. Kruger introduced a strict quality control system. Every printed banknote went through inspection at several stages. First, a visual examination in daylight, then a check under an ultraviolet lamp, then held up to the light for the watermarks, and finally, a comparison of the serial number against the reference tables. Banknotes that passed all checks were divided into three classes. Class 1, perfect counterfeits, were sent to spies in neutral countries and used to purchase gold. Class 2, good counterfeits, went to payments for collaborators in occupied territories. Class 3, minor rejects, were set aside for the original plan to drop them from aircraft. But there was one problem that no chemist and no mathematician could solve. Brand new banknotes looked like brand new banknotes, crisp, perfectly flat, without a single crease. Any cashier accustomed to handling real money in circulation would have sensed something was wrong. The money had to look like money that had already been in someone's pocket. Kruger solved this problem with German methodical precision. A special brigade was created within the barracks. Its sole task was the aging of banknotes. The prisoners would line up in long rows and pass bundles of money from hand to hand, crumpling them, rubbing them, rolling them into tubes to imitate the wear of being carried in a pocket. Some deliberately dirtied their hands before work. Others made tiny tears along the edges. Others pierced the bundles with a pin because the British traditionally fastened banknotes with pins, and the pinholes on a banknote looked like a mark of authenticity. The result exceeded all expectations. The finished banknotes passed inspection in Swiss banks. Professional cashiers would take them in hand, examine them, hold them up to the light, and hand them back without a question. The only way to expose the forgery was to find two banknotes carrying the same serial number, which was only possible by chance. The presses in Barracks 19 ran around the clock. Bundles of pounds grew, were packed into crates, and disappeared in an unknown direction. The prisoners were printing money they would never be able to spend. Money that was traveling across all of Europe. And no one on the outside had the faintest idea where it was coming from. The first major customer of the counterfeit pounds was German intelligence. The Abwehr and the SS began paying their agents across Europe with them. Neutral countries, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey, became the main platforms for laundering the forgeries. The money went toward purchasing gold, strategic raw materials, and information. One of the most remarkable cases was the story of the man referred to in German files as Cicero. His real name was Eliezer Basner. He worked as the valet of the British ambassador in Ankara and sold secret documents to German intelligence directly from the embassy safe. Basner passed the Germans material of exceptional value. Among it was intelligence about the Allied plans for the landings in Normandy, information that could have changed the entire course of the war. For his work, he received £300,000 sterling from the Germans, an enormous sum by the standards of any era. Basner was certain he had become a wealthy man. He dreamed of life after the war, of owning his own hotel, of a peaceful old age. When the war ended, he attempted to invest his money in a business, and only then did he learn the truth. All £300,000, every single banknote, were counterfeit. The Germans had paid their best spy with money from Barracks 19. Another major operation was connected to the rescue of Benito Mussolini in 1943. Otto Scorzeny, the legendary SS commando, was preparing an operation to extract the Italian dictator from a mountain prison. The informants who helped track Mussolini's location received £100,000 sterling as payment. Counterfeit. The scale of production by 1944 had become colossal. The presses in the barracks ran without stopping. By various estimates, the total printed over the course of the operation was between £134 million and £300 million sterling. That amounted to between 10 and 15% of all pounds in circulation anywhere in the world at that moment. It was precisely then, at the peak of production, that Kruger set the team a new task. The next target was to be the American dollar, the currency that by the middle of the war had become the world's primary reserve currency. If the pound was a strike against Britain, the dollar would be a strike against all the Allies simultaneously. The prisoners understood this instantly. All 140 people in the barracks understood the same thing at the same moment. As long as they were printing pounds, they were needed. The moment they produced a perfect dollar, their work would be finished, and carriers of secrets in the Reich were never left alive. The sabotage began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Someone reported that the gelatine used in a particular stage of the printing process was behaving unpredictably. Someone discovered that American paper required a fundamentally different ink composition. Someone noted that the ink on dollar banknotes had a particular greenish tint that was impossible to reproduce with the available materials. Every problem was technically justified. Every explanation sounded convincing. Kruger pressed them, demanded results, made threats. The prisoners nodded, agreed, promised to solve the problem by the following week, and then found a new problem. Adolf Berger later described those months as the most tense game of his life. Every day it was necessary to demonstrate enough progress to show that work was continuing, but not enough to come close to a result. Too slow, and Kruger would suspect sabotage. Too fast, and the dollar would be ready. They stalled with professional mastery. Several months became a year, then a year and a half. The dollar never left Barracks 19 as a finished product. And then April of 1945 arrived, and everything changed. From the west, the Americans were advancing. From the east, the Red Army was moving rapidly. Berlin was burning, the Reich was crumbling with every passing day, and into Barracks 19 came the order that everyone had feared from the very first day. Shut down production, destroy the equipment, prepare for evacuation. The prisoners packed the crates in silence. No one knew what the word evacuation meant in the context of the final days of the Reich. Everyone understood one thing: carriers of secrets know too much. And the Reich, even a dying one, had enough people willing to carry out a final order. The trucks headed south toward the Austrian Alps. 140 people, crates of money and printing matrices, SS guards. Ahead lay a lake in the mountains and Himmler's order, the contents of which the prisoners did not yet know. But they would find out soon. The convoy of trucks traveled south for several days. The roads were clogged with retreating German units, refugees, and broken equipment. The Reich was dying before their very eyes. But the guard around the prisoners from Barracks 19 did not ease. They were transported carefully, like cargo that could not be lost before the right moment. The final destination was the Ebensee concentration camp in the Austrian Alps. A beautiful place. Mountains, lakes, spring air, and an order that Himmler had given before the convoy had even set off. Liquidate all prisoners, destroy the equipment, sink the money and the matrices. Part of the order was carried out immediately. Crates containing the printing matrices and millions of counterfeit pounds were loaded onto boats and taken out to the middle of the mountain, Lake Toplitz. Crate after crate sank into the black, cold water. The money over which 140 people had worked for 3 years disappeared to the bottom, but the second part of the order was never carried out. The commandant of Ebensee hesitated. Perhaps he understood that the war was lost and did not want extra blood on his hands in the final days. Perhaps the order simply failed to arrive in time through the chaos of a disintegrating army. The SS guards began to scatter. On the 5th of May, 1945, American forces entered the Ebensee camp. 140 prisoners from the counterfeiting team came out to meet them alive. The carriers of secrets had survived. By chance, in the final hours of the war, they had slipped through the gap between an order and its execution. The American officers did not immediately understand who they were talking to. Before them stood exhausted people in civilian clothing who began telling an incredible story about counterfeit money, a concentration camp outside Berlin and a lake in the mountains. The investigators listened and took notes. What they heard defied comprehension. The first physical evidence appeared on its own. Local residents in Austrian villages along the river Tron began noticing strange objects in the water. British banknotes. They floated down the river like fallen leaves, washed up on the banks, and became caught in the reeds. Several crates on the bottom of the lake had apparently broken open on impact. Villagers fished the money out with nets, dried it in the sun, and took it to local shops. Some of the banknotes were accepted without question. No one knew that what they held in their hands was the product of the most large-scale counterfeiting operation in the history of humanity. For them, it was simply money found in a river. When the first samples reached British military investigators, they were immediately forwarded to London. The Bank of England received a bundle of banknotes with a note stating they had been retrieved from an Austrian river. The experts began their examination, and what they discovered caused genuine panic in London. The banknotes were perfect. The paper, the watermarks, the serial numbers, the degree of wear. Everything was flawless. The only difference from genuine banknotes that the experts found was visible only under a powerful microscope and a quartz lamp. The eyes of the Britannia figure in the watermark glowed slightly more dimly than on the original. The difference was so small that under normal conditions, no one would have noticed it. The Bank of England began assessing the scale. As testimony from surviving prisoners arrived alongside data from liberated SS archives, the figures became increasingly alarming. £134 million of confirmed production. By other estimates, up to 300 million. Between 10 and 15% of all British currency in the world. This meant one thing. Across all of Europe, in the banks of Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, and Turkey, in the pockets of thousands of people who had no idea that Operation Bernhard had ever existed, counterfeit pounds were in circulation. Withdrawing them quietly was impossible. Acknowledging it publicly meant undermining confidence in British currency for years to come. The Bank of England made the only decision it could. All banknotes with a denomination above £5 were declared invalid, all at once. Every one that existed anywhere in the world. Genuine and counterfeit together. A new design was issued incorporating a metal security thread that could not be reproduced by the methods of Operation Bernhard. The reputation of the pound sterling, the currency considered absolutely impossible to counterfeit, had been broken. The overconfidence of the Bank of England, the very same overconfidence with which everything had begun in 1939, had turned into one of the most resounding financial scandals in British history. Meanwhile, Bernhard Kruger was arrested by British military forces. He was interrogated and handed over to the French, who upon learning of his skills did not imprison him, but instead put him to work for French intelligence. Forging documents. He did this for approximately a year before being released. In 1948, Kruger stood before a denazification court in Germany. The prosecution was prepared for a severe sentence. But something unexpected happened in the courtroom. One after another, former prisoners from Barracks 19 took the witness stand. The Jews he had used as instruments, and they spoke in his defense. They stated that Kruger had pulled them out of the queues for the gas chambers of Auschwitz. that the conditions in Barracks 19 had been incomparably better than in the rest of the camps, that it was he, intentionally or not, who had given them a chance to survive. The court acquitted Bernhard Kruger. The Reich's chief counterfeiter walked free. After liberation, the 140 scattered across the world. Many went to Israel, which had just declared independence. Others settled in America, Western Europe, and Australia. They returned to peaceful life, carrying a weight that could not be put into words. 3 years in a golden cage where the price of a mistake was your life. Most of them stayed silent for many years, not because they were afraid, but because the post-war world was not particularly interested in complicated stories. Stories where the villain saves the victims, where the victims defend the villain, where a weapon of destruction becomes an instrument of survival. Such stories did not fit neatly into the simple post-war narratives. Adolf Berger stayed silent longer than the others. He returned to his profession, worked as an engraver, and lived a quiet life in Czechoslovakia. But inside him, all those years lived a story that he considered his duty to tell. The story of 140 people whom the world had almost forgotten. In 1975, Berger wrote a book. It was called The Devil's Workshop. It contained his personal memoirs about Barracks 19, about Kruger, about the sabotage, about the fear, and about the strange professional excitement that never disappeared even there. The book was published in a small print run and at first passed almost unnoticed. The world only turned its attention to the story of Operation Bernhard in 2007. Austrian director Stefan Ruzowitzki made a feature film based on Berger's book. The film was called The Counterfeiters. In 2008, it received the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film of the Year. Adolf Berger lived to the age of 99. Until his final days, he gave interviews, spoke before school children, and participated in documentary projects. He said the same thing again and again, not so that people would feel sorry for him, but so that people would understand how it works, how a system turns people into instruments, and how people find ways to remain human even within that system. In 1959, the magazine Stern organized an expedition to Lake Toplitz in the Austrian Alps. Divers descended to the bottom and began raising the crates, one after another. Inside each one lay bundles of British pound sterling stuck together after years of submersion. Millions of counterfeit banknotes that had rested on the bottom for 14 years. Local residents who were present at the recovery described it as a strange sight. Money that looked genuine, that technically was almost genuine, lying on the bottom of a mountain lake of no use to anyone. A weapon that never fired in the way it had been intended. Salomon Smolyanov, a professional counterfeiter before the war and the informal artistic director of the production in the barracks, disappeared into the shadows after liberation. According to rumors that were never officially confirmed, he used his skills to forge documents, not for personal gain. For Jews who were emigrating illegally to Palestine and who needed documents to cross borders. The same talent, a different mission. Bernhard Kruger, after his acquittal, found employment at the Hahnemüller Company, the very same company that had supplied the paper for the counterfeit pounds during the war. He worked there for many years, retired and died in 1989 at the age of 84. Quietly, of natural causes. Condemned by no one, Operation Bernhard was conceived as a weapon of destruction, the destruction of the British economy and British confidence in its own currency. It did not achieve that goal. Britain held firm. The pound survived, though it took a serious blow to its reputation. But the operation achieved a different result that no one had planned for. It preserved the lives of 140 people whom the system had sentenced to death. People whom the Reich considered subhuman and used as instruments, and who used that instrument to survive and tell the truth. If this story moved you, please leave a like. It is the only way to tell us that stories like this matter. We retrieve them from archives, from old books, from the testimony of people whom almost no one remembers. Your subscription helps us keep doing this. Where are you watching from? Write your city in the comments. Thank you for ensuring that Adolf Berger and the 140 prisoners of Barracks 19 do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.